24 May 1944, Italy. Dearest Grace, this is going to be a hard letter to write, but since it has to be written, I'm glad that I'm here to do it. Maybe you've already guessed what I'm going to say, because of the way that I am saying it, and because of the fact that I'm in Italy. I hope you have. As you know, there's been a lot of action going on recently over here, and Bob's been in it. There are a lot of brave men up there, and one of them was Bob. The bravest man I'd ever hoped to know. And sis, it is because of his bravery many lives have been saved. Someone had to pay the price, though, and that one was Bob. Yes, sis, Bob has been killed in action. I know little of what that means to you, Grace, and I'm sorry. But, since it had to happen, I'm proud of the way it did. You'll be proud too when you hear how it happened. You want to know how it happened? I'm sure since I was there with him. I want to tell you as much as I can. I can't give you the names of the places involved, but someday I'll give you the names as well. I've spoken to Lieutenant Bedsole, who was with Bob at the very time, and here's what he told me. There's a bridge that crossed the railroad along the front line where Bob was stationed. And a very important bridge for, among other things, the road is one of the main supply lines for our army. Here's a little drawing, crude though it may be, of the area around that spot that I think will help you to get clear pictures and better understanding of what happened. Under each corner of the bridge, the Germans had placed dynamite to blow up the bridge. Lieutenant Bedsole with Lieutenant Hargraves of the reconnaissance unit were sent forward to see if they would draw fire into a certain area. They had 2 peeps and some enlisted men with them. They drove along. They saw the commanding officer of their group and an Italian talking with Bob. They stopped and found out the Italian had offered to show them some German positions. So Bob and the Italian got into the first prep, and by means of a detour went forward about a mile or more ahead of the infantry and came to the bridge. Bob stopped the peeps, and just before going over the bridge and immediately saw the Germans had mined the bridge. It also saw some German positions numbered 1 and 2. And 3. He gave the command to scatter and told the driver of the second peep to go back for help. They drove the first peep over the other side of the bridge, for there was a machine gun on the peep, and the other side was a better position to fire from. They started firing on the Germans that they had seen, but just then a machine gun located at number 4 opened fire on them, killing Bob, the Italian, and some other enlisted men. Lieutenant Bedsole was with Bob at the end of the bridge, but the fire missed him, and he was able to take cover at the end of the bridge. Bob could have done the same, but someone had to get the machine gun off the peep in order to save the rest of the men. Bob tried to do that. During the action that followed it, Lieutenant Bedsole called several times to Bob, but he never got an answer. So judging from that and from the wounds in his back, he was killed instantly. After a while, the Germans came back to reset the fuse and blow the bridge. But at the time, a shell landed on the bridge and scared the Germans away. A few moments after that, about 20 or 25 reinforcements arrived, sent by the man Bob had directed to go back for help, and L.T. Bedsole and the remaining men were saved. Lieutenant Bedsole said over and over again to me that if it had not been for Bob's presence of mind to scatter the men and send for help, no one would ever come back alive, and the bridge would have been gone. The above happened on the 21st of May, about 4 p.m. At 3:30 p.m. on the 23rd, the service was held for Bob, led by Chaplain Ralph Altson. It was a double service for another captain who had arrived only a short time ago, who had been killed the next day. About 30 men came back from the front and a number of officers. Among the officers were Lieutenant Woodward, Lieutenant Gills, Lieutenant Gatton, Captain Miller, Captain McKinsey, and several other officers. Lieutenant Ragland of the Air Supply, who lives in the same apartment as I, and also got to know Bob while we were visiting each other. There was also the chaplain read from the first of the 23rd Psalm, and then read Jesus, Lover of my soul. He then went on to say a number of things about Bob, speaking of the respect all had for him, of the way he always thought of others first. Then just before he started to close, he paused and said, if ever there were a Christian, Bob Collin was the one. He then told how that every Sunday before Bob had been talking about heaven and was very much interested in what it was like. He then read a number of scriptures about heaven that Bob had spoken about and closed with a sweet prayer. After that, I went forward, saluted Bob, and the rest of the officers followed and saluted also. There were a lot of war-hardened men there, Grace, but there were also a lot of misty eyes. If I ever met a man could love another man, those men loved Bob. I'd like to say a few things about Bob that the men have told me about how they loved him, respected him, and also how that many men had told me they want you and Jack to be proud of Bob. So I'm just going to try to tell you a few things that come to mind. Please forgive me if they sound a little confused at times. I must confess, my eyes are a little misty even now. First of all, Grace, here's a harsh, cruel fact. They aren't able to hold a funeral service for all the men that are killed on the battlefield, yet Bob had one. And very few of those who do have services have that many people there. Yet the very men who were leading the attack on the vital points that must be taken took the time out to be there. The service was held a long ways from the front, but there were at least 6 vehicles of various kinds used to carry the men back where Bob was, even 2 half-tracks. That was all they could get, so that's how they came. Even the Calost Italian laborers working there sensed that this was something different, and they all stopped their work and came and stood at attention with us. I've been to several times by several men, so it must be true that the work Bob did during the campaign saved the lives of at least 1,000 men. And when they went to take a certain town, I'm sure you have heard of it in the paper, Bob personally led the attack, and because of the way that he maneuvered the men and equipment, very few lives were lost. Many have said that they never have seen a man more completely unafraid. When the rest of the men would be hiding during an attack, he would go from one position to another, giving directions. Yet he never was hurt because he knew how to handle himself and knew the country like a book. If there were ever a good position for his men, Bob found it. He found it because he was always there ahead of his men. He never smoked, never drank, and never used a cuss word. He never got angry with his men, yet he wasn't a sissy. There wasn't a man in the battalion who couldn't beat in boxing. I also believe there were a few that he couldn't outrun, yet he always made it a point to be at services with the men, if it was at all possible. Everyone knew he was a Christian. Do you remember Captain Frank Miller, Grace? He came down to find me, not knowing where I was, not knowing my address, not even knowing my first name. Yet he found me. He knew Bob would have wanted me there. He thought a great deal of Bob and asked very specially to be remembered to you. He asked me to tell you that if he ever comes back, that he's coming to see you personally. I didn't get to see very many of the men for more than a few moments at the time because they were all rather busy, but I could tell the death of Bob meant more to them than they'd all been through during this war. They all want you to be proud to be the wife and mother of the son of Bob. I know that doesn't take a piece of Bob, nothing can, but it does ease the pain a little. God has made great men in this world, and among the great men he made Bob. Remember that, dear. Lovingly, your brother Frank. Signed,